Percy and the Brake Van, written by Christopher Audrey and narrated by me, Daniel Celano. One day, Percy was standing at the junction. He had a long goods train which he was taking to Tidmouth, but he had to wait for Henry to pass with the passenger train before he could go on. Henry was late, but the sun was warm, and Percy didn't mind. At last Henry arrived. "I'm sorry I'm late," he panted. "I had to wait ages for the connection at the other railway. Do you know," he went on, "that they have goods trains on the other railway that don't have brake vans? It doesn't seem right, does it? You've still got yours, I'm glad to see." "Ah, there's the signal. I must try and make up a bit more lost time. Goodbye." And he puffed importantly away. Percy told his driver what Henry had said about brake vans. His driver laughed. "Goods trains on the other railway have special brakes," he explained, "like passenger trains, and Henry's flying kipper. They don't need brake vans. Your trucks just have couplings, so they need brakes at each end of the train in case a coupling snaps. You know how stupid trucks are. They did it to James on Gordon's Hill, remember?" "Pooh!" scoffed Percy. "I know how to keep my trucks in order. What's good enough for the other railway is good enough for me. I don't need a stupid brake van." "Don't be so silly, Percy," said his driver. Percy took no notice. It would have been better if he had. A few days later, Percy was shunting trucks at the harbor near the big station. He was just completing his train by backing onto the brake van when the shunter's attention was distracted. The shunter thought he had coupled the brake van to the train, but he hadn't. The guard blew his whistle, and Percy set off quickly, hoping to get a run at the hill leading to the main line. But the guard and his brake van were left behind. The guard waved and shouted, but Percy didn't hear. He was too busy climbing the hill. All might have been well if Percy had not started so quickly. Unfortunately, the jerk had weakened one of the couplings. As Percy snorted up the hill, the weight of the loaded trucks dragging behind the weak coupling broke it. The last four trucks began to run back down the slope towards the harbor. The guard was standing on the veranda of his brake van, and he saw the trucks coming. Quickly he ran to his brake handle and checked that it was fully on. Then he jumped clear. He was just in time. The trucks hit the brake van with a resounding crash. The van shuddered and was pushed along the line, but somehow it stayed on the rails, and the trucks' mad rush was halted. Meanwhile, Percy's firemen had noticed that they had lost the tail of their train. Percy came slowly back down the hill to see what had happened. "Phew!" remarked Percy's driver as they helped to clear up the mess. "You see, Percy, brake vans do have their uses after all." And Percy had to admit that his driver was right. The end. Responsibilities. Written by Christopher Audrey and narrated by me, Daniel Celano. Percy was spending the night at the shed at the big station before returning to his work on Thomas's branch line next day. "Well, well, little Percy," said Gordon grandly. "It's nice to have you with us for a change. You and Thomas and Toby are running that branch line of yours officially, I suppose." "I think so, Gordon," replied Percy, though he wasn't quite sure what officially meant. "That's right," rumbled the big engine. "No late trains or angry passengers. An efficient railway is a great responsibility, as I, of course, know only too well. What the Fat Controller would do without me to keep things running smoothly, I simply can't imagine." "James and Henry do their best," Gordon went on, "but someone has to keep a responsible eye on things." "It must be splendid to race along with a train of heavy coaches," sighed Percy enviously. "When you were ill that time, it took Thomas and Duck and me to move them, and even then, the three of us couldn't go very fast." "Never mind," said Gordon. "You kept things running. That's what matters. It's a knack, I suppose. My big wheels help, but there's more to it than that, of course." Next morning, Gordon had steam up before Percy. Percy needed water, but because he hadn't enough steam to move, Gordon offered to push him to the water column. "Thank you, Gordon," said Percy gratefully. That would be very kind. Not at all, replied Gordon grandly. It all helps the smooth running of the railway. Responsibilities, my dear Percy. Responsibilities. Percy had a long drink. Soon his steam pressure had risen nicely, and he was ready to go and find his trucks. Gordon, meanwhile, had not returned to the shed. He dozed in the sunshine until it was his turn to take water. Percy moved away. Gordon tried to follow him, but found that he couldn't. Come on, Gordon, said his driver. We haven't gotten all day. Your train is due out in an hour. I can't move, Gordon groaned furiously. I've got cramp. I can't move my piston. Percy's drivers came to see what was the matter. Jammed valves, I reckon, said Gordon's driver. And while the fireman went to find an inspector, Percy gently buffered up to Gordon's front. Puffing hard, he managed to push Gordon back into the shed and then went quietly away to fetch his trucks. He didn't say anything. Somehow, it didn't seem tactful. Later, when Percy met Thomas at the junction, he told him what had happened. Poor old Gordon, chuckled Thomas. But there, that's what it is to have responsibilities. And the two of them puffed off to run the branch line as efficiently as they knew how. The end. Thomas and Trevor, written by Christopher Audrey and narrated by me, Daniel Celano. Trevor the traction engine was lonely. Edward came to see him every day, but there wasn't enough work for Trevor to do, and it depressed him terribly. I do like to keep busy, he sighed one day, and I like company, especially children. Cheer up, smiled Edward. The Fat Controller has a job for you. He sent me to tell you about it. I'm to take you to the junction to meet Thomas today. Oh, explained Trevor happily. A harbor. That means the seaside, and that means children. How marvelous! Thomas was waiting at the junction. He was on his way to the harbor with a trainload of steel pilings. These would be built into the harbor walls to make them firm and safe. Hello, Thomas, said Edward. This is Trevor, an old friend of mine. He's a traction engine. Thomas eyed the newcomer doubtfully. A what? He asked. A traction engine, explained Trevor. A steam engine who runs on roads instead of rails. Can you take me to the harbor, please? Edward says the Fat Controller has a job for me. Workmen coupled Trevor's truck to Thomas's train, and they set off. Useful engines run on rails, grumbled Thomas to himself, but luckily Trevor didn't hear him. I'm glad the Fat Controller needs me, said Trevor happily. I don't have enough to do sometimes, you know, although I can work anywhere, in orchards, on farms, in scrapyards, even at harbors. Thomas was puzzled. But you don't run on rails, he objected. I don't need rails to be useful, replied Trevor. You wait and see. But when they reached the harbor, they found everything in confusion. Trucks had come off the rails. They blocked the line, and the stones they had held lay higgledy-piggledy. We must get these piling past, said Thomas's driver. They're vital. If we only had a tractor here to drag them round this mess. Terence could have done it just the sort of job I like, interrupted Trevor excitedly. Get me off this truck, please, and I'll soon show you what traction engines can do. Quickly they unloaded him, and he set to work at once. First he dragged the stones clear with chains. Then he towed into position the pilings which Thomas had brought, so that they were ready for the workmen to use. Everything was ship-shape before the foreman could say, Fat Controller. And later, when Thomas brought Annie and Clarabelle full of children from the villages along his branch line, Trevor gave them rides along the harbor. He had the time of his life. Everyone was sorry when it was time for Trevor to go. They loaded him onto his truck once more, and Thomas pulled him to the junction. I'll come and see you again if I can, he promised. If those silly trucks don't behave, we may need you again. That would be wonderful, said Trevor. And that night, when he fell happily asleep under the apple trees in the vicarage orchard, he dreamed of Thomas, the Fat Controller's harbor, and, most of all, children. The end. Terence Turns Pot Hunter. Written by Christopher Audrey. Narrated by me, Daniel Celano. One morning at the beginning of summer, A party of young people were waiting at the junction when Thomas arrived. They had a great many boxes and cases with them, all of which they loaded into Clarabelle. "Oh, they're heavy!" she groaned. But the people took no notice. Laughing and talking together, they climbed into Annie. Thomas wondered who they were. He wondered even more when they all got out at Hackenback, the halt near the tunnel. During the days which followed, Thomas watched as they spread their belongings across a small field near the station. Then Terence came, and was put to work clearing piles of topsoil to the edges of the field. He was resting near the station one day when Thomas arrived. "What are they doing?" Thomas asked. "Don't really know," replied Terence. "Owner says it's something called a dig, but I didn't really understand, and I couldn't be bothered to ask." Thomas's driver laughed. "They're archaeologists, Terence," he explained. "People who are interested in history. They're digging in the field because they're hoping to find important historical remains there." Terence was disappointed. He'd expected something more exciting than that. "I expect it is exciting if you find something," said Thomas's driver. "But what if you don't?" objected Terence. "They'll just have had a lot of hard work for nothing. That's not my idea of fun. When I work hard in the field, I've got something to show for it. Scraping around with little trowels all day, pooh! If that's art, whatever you said, I think it's a silly waste of time." The summer wore on with no sign that the diggers were finding anything special. They lived in tents, and now and then 2 or 3 of them would take the train to the top station and return with boxes of food. That was the only time they took any notice of the train. While they were digging, they ignored them completely. At first, Thomas whistled as he passed, but no one waved in return. "Bother them! I shall save my steam for something useful," said Thomas's tank engine. At last one day in the autumn, Thomas made a longer stop than usual at the halt. The party's boxes were again loaded into Clarabelle. She groaned more than ever, because this time there were more of them. The people got into Annie. They didn't talk and laugh this time. They seemed depressed. "I think they've had a wasted summer," remarked Thomas's driver. "No doubt they get used to it." Autumn was the time of year that Terence always liked. "It's not too hot," he would say, "and I've got something I can get my plow into. There's always plenty to do in the autumn." "Some of us have to work all the year round," Thomas teased him. "My passengers don't let me have 9 months holiday a year, like some tractors I could mention." Terence laughed. "You're only jealous," he said, but he knew that he would really like to be able to get into the fields more often. One day his owner took him to a small field near the halt. It was on the opposite side of the line to where the archaeologists had had their wasted summer. It had been used as a hayfield and for pasturing sheep. "We've got to plow deep here," Terence's owner told him. "I'm reducing my sheep flock and I don't need this field for grazing anymore. I want to put a crop in it next year instead." Terence found it heavy going. He dug his tracks in and pulled hard. They had plowed about half the field and were turning at the end of a furrow. The plow was lifted to make the turn, and at that moment both Terence and his driver heard a rattle from behind them. Terence stopped and his owner looked back. "What's the matter?" asked Terence. "Have we broken something?" "Seems all right," said his owner. "Can't be anything to do with us. Let's just—" Suddenly he broke off. "Wait a minute," he said. "What's that?" He jumped down and dug with his hands in the freshly turned furrow. Then he came slowly to show Terence what he had found. "Pooh!" said Terence scornfully. "It's just a dirty old bit of pottery." "It's old, certainly," agreed his owner, "and I can't deny it's dirty either. I'm going to the telephone box near the station. I won't be long." He came back looking excited. "We'll have to leave this field for a bit," he said. "I've just been talking to the curator of the museum at Tisbeth. He wants to come and have a look at our pot before we plow any more." "Whatever for?" asked Terence in amazement, but his owner smiled and said nothing. Terence happened to be in the farmyard when the curator arrived, and realized at once that he had been one of the diggers that summer. His owner went quickly into the farmhouse to get the pot. The curator inspected it closely using a magnifying glass. "You're right," he said at last. "Roman, I think, but I'll need a second opinion. Where exactly was it found, Terence?" "I'll show you," said Terence. When they reached the field, the courier looked around in surprise. "But this is just opposite where we were in the summer," he exclaimed. "How on earth—" A week later, he was back again. This time, he had three important-looking gentlemen and a map with him. They gazed at the map and poked at the ground excitedly with trowels, speaking in low voices as they did so. Terence quickly grew bored. He wanted to go and do something useful, but his owner wouldn't let him. After what seemed a very long time, the courier came over to where Terence and his owner stood. He stood in front of Terence and cleared his throat. "You, Terence," he announced importantly, "have made a significant, yes, significant discovery. You have found in one morning what my friends and I failed to find for a whole summer. Our map was out of date, and what we wanted to find now turns out to be on this side of the railway and not the other. So next year, I shall get my party together again, and we can be sure of something worth finding. Well done, Terence. You and your plow have solved several mysteries for us. Thank you." Next summer, the diggers came again and made a great fuss of Terence. When the site had been cleared, they took a photograph of him beside the Roman remains he had helped to find. Terence was as proud as can be. He doesn't think archaeology is a silly waste of time now. The end. On Your Guard, written by Christopher Audrey, narrated by me, Daniel Celano. Ben's driver looked at a notice which was pinned to the board inside the engine shed. "Watch out," he read aloud. "There's a thief about." "What's a thief?" asked Ben. "Someone who takes things without asking," replied Bill. "Like Bogle did with our trucks once?" "That's right," agreed Bill. "So driver says we must be on our guard." Ben was dismayed. "My guard's nice," he wailed. "I don't want to hurt him." His driver tried to explain. "Bill means we must keep a good lookout for people who shouldn't be here," he said. "But you and firemen do that anyway," objected Ben. "So why should we worry?" The driver gave it up. There were two small sheds at the China Clay Works, and Bill and Ben would usually spend the night in whichever happened to be nearest. The sheds stood next to each other and were connected by a short passage. One night, after a day spent working in the dispatch sidings, Phil went to the main shed. Ben, who had been up at the clay pits, came back late and went to the other. The drivers put out their fires, cleaned them, and went home. Ben woke during the night feeling lonely. He wondered for a moment what had wakened him, and then heard a door close softly. Driver must have come back for something, he thought. He was preparing to go to sleep again when he heard the sound of a nearby footstep. Opening his eyes, he could just make out a dark figure coming towards him. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice echoing eerily in the empty shed. There was a quick intake of breath, followed by what sounded like a collision between two people. "Ow!" said a voice. "What's that?" said another. There was a pause. "Must have been the wind," said the second voice. "What's that shadow over there?" The first man switched on the torch and was found that the shadow was Ben. "Only an engine," he said. "Nothing to worry about. Where does that passage go?" "How should I know?" retorted the other. "You're the one with the torch. Come on, that engine standing there gives me the willies." There was a sound of retreating footsteps. Ben realized that the men must have left both passage doors open, for soon he heard Bill's voice. "Hello," it said, booming through the passageway. Immediately there was a shout and a clatter. Feet ran back along the passage and back into Ben's shed. "Boo!" said Ben playfully. It was too much for the intruders. "That engine's back there again," wailed one. "I'm off!" Careless of noise now, the two made for the main door of the shed, shot through it, and slammed it behind them. Next morning, the drivers found a broken torch lying on the floor at Bill's end of the passage. "Who's been here in the night?" they asked the engines. "Don't know," said Bill. "Ben and I wanted to play, but they shouted and ran away." Ben's driver had been checking around the shed. "Nothing seems to be missing," he said. "You're pulling our leg," he accused the engines. "We're not," squeaked Bill and Ben indignantly. "There were two men, and when we tried to play hide and seek, they ran away. They must have dropped the torch when they went." The drivers remained unconvinced. The end. Jack in the Box, written by Christopher Audrey, narrated by me, Daniel Celano. One day, as James puffed into the big station, he saw a large wooden crate standing on the platform. I wonder where Dad's going, he thought to himself. But then, in the bustle of arrival, he forgot all about it. His fireman uncoupled him from the train, and James went off to the shed for a drink. When he came back, the crate had gone. It's been put on our train, his driver told him. Guard thought he'd have a job getting it into his van, but he needn't have worried. It turned out to be as light as a feather. The guard himself came up. Have you found out what's in that crate then? Joked the driver. Don't ask me, replied the guard. We only take them where the label tells us to. But if you want to know what I think. He broke off teasingly. Yes, said James, his driver and fireman all at once. I think it's empty, finished the guard. Empty, echoed James. Who'd want to send an empty crate on a train? Not our business to worry about that, laughed the guard, and went back to his van. He was just about to blow his whistle for James to start when a late passenger arrived. James thought he must be important because he had to wait while the guard and the station master helped the late comer into a carriage. At last everything was ready. Come on, come on, come on, grumbled James impatiently. He tried to make up for the lost time, but because he was running late, Douglas with a goods train had been allowed to go in front of them. James had to wait at signals outside Thomas's Junction until the line was clear. Stupid things, he muttered crossly. How can I be expected to run my trains properly if signals keep stopping me all the time? Now, James, warned his driver, you know perfectly well you'd be even later if you had an accident. At last the signal arm rose. James started with an important jerk and hurried to the platform. Peep, 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 he whistled to the passengers. Get in quickly, please. They were only too glad to, but when the driver looked out for the guard's green flag, there was no sign of either him or his flag. The station master came to see what was causing the delay. Have you seen the guard? Asked James's driver. The station master shook his head. Now you mention it, he said. I don't remember seeing him at all this trip. He stopped. Just a moment, he said, listening. What's that noise? Everyone, including James, tried to be quiet as they could. A thumping noise seemed to be coming from the guard's van. Driver and station master ran to the doors and threw them open. The thumping became suddenly louder, and now they could hear muffled cries too. Help! A voice was shouting. Help! Help! It's coming from inside that crate, exclaimed the station master. Quickly they unlatched the lid. When they lifted it, they found the guard very red in the face and very cross. He looked nothing like so smart as a guard should look. Hello, said James's driver. Are you playing at Jack-in-the-Boxes? No, I'm not, said the guard crossly. But what happened? Asked the station master. The guard looked sheepish. I wanted to make sure that the crate was empty, he explained. It wasn't locked, so I opened it and looked in while James was stopped at the signal. Then he started with a jerk, and I overbalanced into it. The lid fell on top of me and latched itself shut. The other men laughed until their sides ached. The driver was laughing when he came back to James's cab, and was still laughing when he had finished telling James and his fireman the story. But James didn't laugh. Now he had even more time to make up. For once he agreed with the guard. He didn't think he was funny either. The end.